Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 15th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being Here, therefore, the principle of polarity is brought into requisition. Here we go. As we have supposed the interests of one of commander to be always antagonistic to those of the other, we have assumed a true polarity. We reserve a fuller explanation of this for another chapter, merely making the following observation on it at present. The principle of polarity is only valid when it can be conceived in one and at the same thing, where the positive and its opposite, the negative, completely destroyed each other. In a battle, both sides strive to conquer. That is true polarity, for the victory of the one side destroys that of the other. But when we speak of two different things which have a common relation external to themselves, then it's not the things but their relations which have the polarity. So this is a very short paragraph, but nevertheless it represents a cornerstone in von Clausewitz's thought, and it also opens to all a series of considerations that we can make perhaps at the end of the video, and it's very, I would say, simple. It's a very simple paragraph, yet it requires kind of a little effort for the reader, for the student, because in its simplicity it can be, confusing if you have a different system of reference when looking at reality, fundamentally. Not that it's confusing as a paragraph at all. Actually, it's brutally simple, and that's what can make people confusing. We will see now. So, actually later. For now, let's just comment the text. So we have fundamentally also in here von Clausewitz is talking about, is referring to the he's drawing conclusions relatively to the paragraphs that we have read before, and he is stating that we have supposed that the interests of one commander, here he calls it commander, definitely here we're talking still about the original strife, the duel. We're still a bit in here in the realm, in the hybrid realm between absolute theory and the practice in how it manifests itself. So let's say better in absolute abstraction from the actual concretization. And so here it says we have supposed fundamentally that the interests of one commander have to be always antagonistic to those of the other. So these represent a true polarity. He explains it later, but he adds that he reserves a fuller explanation of this for another chapter, merely making the following observation on it at present. So the explanation is, this explanation is all we get now, because von Clausewitz actually never wrote the relative chapter or paragraph. I think I don't know how now he's referring to exactly, but he didn't write it. So this is nevertheless very clear in its essentials, and von Clausewitz in fact drew it pretty simply in order to make understand the very core of the concept. So he's saying, what is the principle of polarity, and why do we consider these two commanders to have always, in theory, an antagonistic interest, one compared to the other, and exhausting fundamentally the matter to those two commanders, ideally. So here it says the principle of polarity, and this is the real juice of the point. The principle of polarity is only valid when it can be conceived in one and the same thing, where the positive and its opposite, the negative, completely destroy each other. What does it mean? Example. He says, in a battle, both sides strive to conquer, to obtain victory. So that is true polarity, for the victory of the one side destroys that of the other. So in here the element is crystalline. because here you have a perfect reciprocal action. Remember the principles of reciprocity that we have seen in the previous paragraphs. Here we're dealing exactly with this at all times. That you can't have two defeated armies. Fundamentally, if there is one victory you have to achieve, the more you approach that, the more the enemy goes, gets detached from it. Ideally, because victory, is only one. If you've assumed that two wrestlers, as von Clausewitz presented us with at the very beginning of his work, are one fighting for compelling the others for their own will, there can't be two things at the same time. Either one wins and the other loses, or vice versa. There can't be the object of victory is this that one. Also in here we could make some exception, but if we accept the full abstraction that von Clausewitz gave us initially as an example to eventually correct, that's the line of thought we have to follow now. Then he says, but when we speak of two different things which have a common relation external to themselves, then it's not the things, but their relations which have the polarity. Now, this is particularly interesting, and the phrase in itself is not excessively clear. Even if you read it in the original, in German, linguistically, it's very simple. It's that elementary, as we have translated now. But the point is, what are these things, these Dinge? They're not the same thing that he's talking about in here, be conceived in one and the same thing, because in there I think he was using the word Gegenstand, which is another thing. Here he is referring, and in order to answer this question, now we can't do it in this video, we'll do it in another one. You should read the following paragraph, because that's where he fully explains that, and it's all very, very clear to get. But here it sounds like fundamentally a sort of mathematical principle, a definition. He even used the electromagnetism metaphor by saying, that there is one objective that is basically either there is one and then its opposite, the negative pole fundamentally. So here von Clausewitz had had formulated the polar principle. Here he's just showing you that it can never happen. Not still making an example, which and a thorough explanation, which it does in the following paragraph, but still setting what the essentials are. Here the two things that have a common relation external to themselves can be imagined as, in fact, two fighters that have all a single aim. But the problem is that they have a connection, an external connection, that with the surrounding environment, let's say. So what von Clausewitz is saying here, that it is not the things in themselves, so these two sides that we have just outlined, but their relations which have the polarity. What it means here is that if you pursue one same objective, you actually never pursue it in an equal way than another person does, because fundamentally you come from an external situation where you are both connected with your objective, with your own competitor, definitely, but also with many other things that fundamentally have to enter into play when you want to reach that objective. This is how the principle of polarity is brought into requisition by von Clausewitz, because he says at that point it's not those two elements that have the polarity, for whichever you do on one kind of reflects on the other with a negative sense. But it's really their relations that own this reciprocity. Now, these relations can be virtually dictated by infinite factors, and these relations are external to each other. I mean, they come to be influenced by external factors, even when these two things effectively are running for one same objective, and they're doing it competing with each other. So like in a fight, for instance. So what this means, and we will see it, I don't even know whether this is actually the because I must confess I struggled myself to fully understand the meaning of it, because this is definitive. This is not just an example thrown there. Here, yeah, von Clausewitz is fundamentally saying, okay, I will write another chapter about this, and I will, I will reserve a fuller explanation. So here, but he wasn't really presenting us with the wall concept that he does eventually in the following paragraph, in some ways, continuing in his logical chain for other reasons that elude now from this strict definition of polarity that he had in mind. But he still gives us the demonstration on how these two, the principle of polarity basically doesn't exist into reality, into politics, in war. And I know we'll get to that later, because I know there is a huge debate that is, an infinite debate that could be risen now. But here let's concentrate on the meaning, and that's how I have read it. That's how I've read this phrase, which is literally now the way it's translated even from the original. So it's so relatively not really Sibylline, because once again the grammar is clear. What is not really clear is what he defines by things in this context, and by external a relation that external to themselves. Actually, it's pretty simple in itself, because I think he wanted to express, just like before with the idea of the pole, fundamentally a physical interaction. Here is not even probably talking about specifically the two wrestlers, because he might have said it, the two, as he does effectively in the following paragraph, where he talks about the attacker and the defender, and in there it's particularly important and very powerful. But here I think the explanation is to be understood in this way. So you may have fundamentally at one point not a direct relation with someone you're going to fight against with, but a relation with the surrounding world that brings you to attain a purpose, to have an aim, to reach an objective, in a way that at that point is not polar to you and whoever you're competing with, but has to do with the surrounding environment and all the relations that that act over you, over the objective, over everything. This is, I know it probably sounds confused. I'm not excessively good at explaining, but believe me, this is one of those statements that really should create a fallout of thoughts and considerations, because this is really what happens in reality, and and the concept of polarization here, of the principle of polarity, how he talks about, is really brought into requisition. The paragraph is really this thing, as we have read it now. It would be dramatically interesting to go on with the 16th, but I decided, as you know, to make one paragraph at a time. So if you want, just go read it. It's number 16, of course, or otherwise, if you're lazy enough, just wait for my next video on von Clausewitz where we'll read it. And it's particularly interesting because in there the example that is provided by von Clausewitz is beautiful, because it also introduces us or keeps us being introduced to the relation between the attack and the defense, that are effectively two different things, and from which von Clausewitz demonstrates the inapplicability of polarity, at least as a descriptive dynamic in reality. So relatively to this concept, there would be actually a lot to talk about, because what is actually the requisition of the principle of polarity? Well, it basically means that the idea of a polar, multifocal world in terms of international politics, of great powers, etc., is a concept that definitely is being used and definitely misused in, I would say, in recent time. I can't even tell, honestly, since when, because this is one of those concepts that I think go hand to hand with terms like geopolitics, like with this idea that fundamentally, and that is also very related to the concept of Schwerpunkt and the interpretations that have been given of it in the Clausewitzian theory. You know that Schwerpunkt is actually untranslatable as a term. Sometimes you can use it as point of balance, center of gravity, stuff like that. Well, center of gravity is kind of more similar to the concept of polarity in many ways, for which fundamentally there is an understanding of international relations that starts from the idea that there is a center of power of some sort that, in this case, is not a Schwerpunkt. There is a pole, let's say, a pole, where just imagine like the globe with all various poles that are fundamentally either, centers of power, centers of balance. In this, the certain conceptions of Schwerpunkt that are erroneous actually kicked in, because the Schwerpunkt is being often misconceived as a physical place. I mean, something that, strategically speaking, on the map you can identify as an area of particular concentration of power or resources that effectively have to strike. This was a thing, I mean, several people and thinkers kind of understood it and explained it in this way, especially I think in the U.S. mostly, but this is something that went actually worldwide, chiefly during not World War II, but during the Cold War. Because at that point, it's when fundamentally the United States started having this presence, this military presence all over the world, with bases here and there, and in the whole strategical, conception, this system, the base tended to be coincident geographically, even in some way. Of course, always maintaining the same focus on force and strength, etc., but with the base in itself. Like saying, if we shift this army or this fleet from here, we will fundamentally make our Schwerpunkt collapse in that area. I'm making it brutally simplified, because obviously I think there is much more to it. And this has never, I think, been wholly misunderstood. I mean, whoever has studied Clausewitzian theory is, for good, is not so ingenuous so naive to believe actually that this is what von Clausewitz meant, because the concept of Schwerpunkt will arrive to it. It's also in here is not difficult to understand. It's actually very easy, but the problem is making our brain working with it in mind and accepting it in the first place. I mean, for me, it's not really, I've kind of came to accept it, but I realize many people have actual difficulties to accept it in the first place. Then, in my opinion, at least for me, it's extremely difficult even to of course, to apply, because it's very, very difficult to find a Schwerpunkt during an operation, a certain situation, etc. But the concept of polarity has prepotently taken over also in here, especially in the last decades, in a way or another, because we have started talking about the repolarization of the world in some ways. It's like, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this idea that fundamentally the world would have grown as a kind of a static, or however, a monopolar world, by the way. Thinking obviously about the West, the United States, in the first line to be the major pole, right? Instead, in the last decade, the very last decades, with the events of, the development of countries like China, also the revival of Russian expansion, they have presented the analysts with this new idea that there were other poles re-emerging. Because the major dichotomy was the bipolar world back in the Cold War with the NATO and then the Warsaw Pact. From these two sides, that is obviously, as any person who is historically acquainted with that phase of history, also a gross mistake, a gross misunderstanding of what that thing really was. Because it is true that there were two things called two blocks, but aside from the fact that there were effectively non-aligned states, but still the same blocks were kind of they had very serious problems. Definitely, it's not that Soviet or Chinese relations have been particularly ever particularly good, nor that there were communist countries that were sometimes even leaning more towards the West. Just thinking about Yugoslavia, or that also in there the concept of blocks, poles, was kind of inapplicable, even if of course these two blocks had even two different philosophies, for free capitalism and communism, but this changed wildly. It was very fluid. It is what brought, in fact, many changes during the same Cold War that is definitely kept evolving. And even if we can use this didactic, if you want, approximations for defining a divided world, two macro areas that fundamentally work together. But even talking about macro areas, what is an area? It doesn't mean anything. These are all approximate concepts. But another very important thing, so the concept of polarity in there is kind of even difficultly applicable, because even if you want, aside from the fact that in magnetism the idea of a multipolar thing is even kind of wrong, but the idea that even the pole in itself, what is a pole? Should find a perfect center of power. What is that exactly? If you take, is it a point? Is it a surface? It's obviously not. It's obviously human beings doing lots of things and doing things that cannot even be remotely, approximated to something like a pole. So there you find things like the center of gravity that brings in an idea that, it sounds so Clausewitzian in many ways, but it's, it's where more or less you have the army, the resources, right? Is it? No, it's not even that. Because look at today now. What is, where's the center of gravity? Where's the internet? Where's the internet? The internet can effectively destroy a country's economy today. Where's the internet physically? And what is the internet, physically speaking? Because that's also a great question. And this doesn't in any way contradict anything of Clausewitzian theory, but on the contrary, it reinforces in an extremely powerful way. This is about the relations, the external relations that exist, that are not, in fact, the polar. That they do not emanate from a pole, but they are polarized in themselves in a way that, however, you can't grasp, because there are so many, they're so complex, they can't even be reduced to a mathematical function ever conceivable, that it doesn't make sense virtually to even talk about things like polarity. This gets down even to banal, gnoseological problems. I mean, it's not a matter of how things are. It's probably even impossible to grasp reality through such a principle of polarity. And even if we were able to do it, it would be of no use, because this fundamentally would evolve brutally. Nobody's able to predict what it will happen. That everybody, even look at strategical analysis today, something that, at a regional or kind of global scale can't even imagine to go beyond 3 months of length, because effectively we don't have the means to understand it. Yeah, of course, we have been creating stuff like, computers that can can foretell major economical crises where all the human analysts kind of fail at a macroscopical global level, etc. But that's still something that can't understand the complexity of war, that is fundamentally tied to so many other factors that you can't program a machine to making it understand them fully. That's why also I believe that it's pure fantasy to imagine an artificial intelligence that is able to deal with certain in a total way into matters like politics and war. And it doesn't matter if we have drones or stuff like that. That's not it. If you look at the whole spectrum of politics and war, that's like a virtually influent thing. Artificial intelligence is not as amazing as it can be, as long as the progress will continue, because the progress will continue. We will be amazed to see what artificial intelligence is. But the problem with artificial intelligence is spotting how it works fundamentally, because once you work, you can't counter it. And you're always a step ahead because you're the one who programs those things. But aside from this is not the point. I don't want to get into it, even though it's interesting. But the point I wanted to make is not just to criticize the principle of polarity in itself, but also the concept of symmetry. Now, the concept of symmetry is one of those things that go in together with, in fact, geopolitics, polarized world, and this other rubbish. Because in here, and it will be more evident actually from also this thing from the next paragraph, but it's kind of still assumable from here with this definition in the 15th chapter, because fundamentally, if you bring into requisition the concept of polarity, compared when you're taking into consideration two fighters, there can be two duelists, two armies, two countries, etc. You deny the fact that there can be a perfect equilibrium between the two, which means that you can't ever have anything like not just two equal enemies, but also two equal conditions. This is actually physics, because we don't have two systems that are equal to one another in nature. There is nothing like that. But it's theory. It's like saying tending to the infinite. We may postulate that it exists, but what is that we effectively do with it? Nothing. Because the concept of infinite is our mathematical definition for saying we don't know what the heck happens in there. Because that's where it's the limit of our biological understanding. That's the same with war. Basically, you can't even... It doesn't make sense to try to be something like equal to one enemy. And I always get I can say altered, because usually I'm a calm. Well, okay, no, I'm not usually a calm person, even if I somewhat sound calming. I believe, at least I was told. But I get at least upset when I hear this idea that this. I don't even know how to say this, but the simplicity, the lack of embarrassment when you hear something like asymmetric warfare. Now, asymmetric warfare is definitely, you can use it as a term if you want to define a certain amount of things. Let's say that you can talk about asymmetric warfare when you want to stress the difference between two, foes, fundamentally, in relation to a given standard. Like, we talk about asymmetric warfare when we talk about things like guerrilla. Well, it doesn't make sense, actually, but people now have introduced this term that is awful. It's terrible, because in fact, it really doesn't mean anything. War, and just print this or nail something, into your brain and remember it till the end of your life. war is by definition asymmetric. There is no war of any kind, no fight, no struggle, no everything, that is ever symmetrical, by definition. You can approximately say, okay, look at these two systems, they kind of resemble each other, and they maybe resemble each other too. Well, there is another one which is kind of very different. Well, yeah, it's a relative statement. And there is also another point, is that asymmetry usually gets coped with into reality. That is, that usually two systems that fight one against the other, actually always, they transform. There is nothing in history like armies that fought in the same exact way, ever. Every army is different, and you know why? Because every single human being is different, and you can't have, and this is the beauty of war, and of history in general, telling the truth, because this goes beyond war in itself. It's a historical assessment. Nothing is ever equal to another thing, ever. And this is one of the few certainties we have in this world, which is extraordinary. This concept is also particularly important when you hear those people who say, history is useful. Sometimes you hear the adverb only added to that. At that point, that person should be crucified, in my opinion. And that history is all important. Is important because it teaches you not to make the same mistake of the past. Which is usually translated like, I can't call this guy whatever I call, wherever I can see the worst thing I can see in history, so that it makes me feel morally, satisfied. This temporary feelings of satisfaction. Well, that's probably the most stupid thing ever, because guess what? In history, there's never a single thing that ever represented itself, ever. So, okay, by approximation also in here we can say, okay, well, there are kind of similar things though, that, yeah, there are kind of similar dynamics, yeah, okay. But if from historical analysis you take away the study of the unpredictable, you're just doing paste and copy stuff in the past that obviously cannot match with what you have now, what you will have in the future, wherever you're interested to look history from. So the same here is in war, meaning that von Clausewitz here is shifting the attention of the reader from a kind of laboratory-like, kind of ascetic, pseudo-scientific approach of history, for telling you, look, that it doesn't matter, what kind of army you are, what kind of weapons you have, what kind of stuff, it doesn't matter, because everything is gonna change dependingly on where you're deployed, for instance, or how you're deployed, what kind of commander you have, or what the most unimaginable thing in the world can intervene on you. This is a very important step conceptually speaking, because it makes you understand that there can't be no scientific approach to things like war. You can't create a system that will make you fight for victory that you just set in that mode, and you're done. It finds the formula, the right formula, the right solution for you. It doesn't happen. War is an art. There is an art of war. There is not a science of war. This is how von Clausewitz actually opens with the Vom Kriege in itself. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So in particular, the concept of asymmetry is explained better in the 16th paragraph. We will see it, but it's also pretty natural. You can have a same goal, but the conditions in which you have to arrive to achieve that goal are different from person to person, from army to army, from state to state. And this is always asymmetric. Then I don't really know how much we can go on with this today. It's even a miracle that I made it to make a video, but in general we can say that this paragraph is probably one of the most important ever, and reading it in couple with the, together with the 16th, the 17th, and also the 18th, but generally speaking, the whole Vom Kriege is fundamental. So never. This is a kind of a war gamer mentality. It's sad. Oh no! Now I will start with the war game thing, but it is still important because I realize that most of us, in terms of we people who more or less get interested in military history, approach history from a sometimes a can say videoludic, but also some kind of wargaming perspective. And it's not our fault. It's not a matter of being an idiot who started playing video games, ruining his adolescence like I did in the process, instead of learning, studying, etc. But no, I'm sure. I'm kidding. Actually, video games are important, I believe, for having a solid understanding of certain things. That they can spark you way more interest than, say, some teachers or even books written by certain people. But there is always this kind of starting round. This is like a match. It's like a chess game. That fundamentally you have a set of rules. You have a given number of resources, of men, of equipment, of conditions that you kind of try to know. I mean, that you give for granted, actually, in a war game. You don't try to know. I was just thinking about how it happens in real war. That's the trick. Fortunately, I still lean from the other side. I haven't come back on the same mistake. And war games. Some war games are actually beautiful, and there is a lot to learn from war games, especially those who are very thoroughly historically researched and so on. But the inconvenient thing of this thing, especially if you don't approach them from a rigorous military historical perspective, is they lead you to assume that there is always a kind of that this kind of given conditions are always known into reality, and also they're given for granted also into reality, and that especially you can reduce the complexity of war to that set of conditions. Like, sometimes it's okay, we do it all the time. I mean, in history, it's the most evident example is when you have sources that are limited by definition. Well, at that point, you realize one thing. First of all, a couple of things. First of all, that history is always approximated. Secondly, that you have either to trust the sources or not. So that's also kind of a, am I right or wrong? Who knows? Third, you also have to read these sources, and aside from the difficulty of interpreting them, you also have to take for logical or illogical the informations that are given to you. So if you want to reconstruct a battle, and you, I don't know, there is a source that says that on that day that it rained, and therefore the ground was softer, or visibility was reduced, or stuff like that. The problem is, even in here, here I've just made some hypothesis. Now, it's not given that that source can tell us, nor we can know from that sources objectively whether rain, let's say, maybe was the determining factor into the outcome of a battle. There is a beautiful passage from Clausewitz that explains exactly this, and tells about the duties of the military historian, like saying, basically, if you're a true historian, you should never ever fundamentally go a step forward than what the source tells you. If you can spot a direct logical connection between cause and consequence, well, you have it's fine, but you can't go beyond. You can make hypotheses, as good as you want, but they're going to remain hypotheses. So what is dramatically and sadly fascinating of history is that most of the times we actually talk about about hypotheses that we give not really for granted, but we try to build a narrative on them. And this is dangerous, because that would be effectively not history. History, as we've seen, just is not a science, but it has at least it presupposes theoretically a scientific method. So if you really wanted to be sure about everything, probably we would have much less written history than we have today. And this really stems from the very beginning. It stems from the source. It stems from the same person who wrote that information or left us that trace, that hint, and it gets, the complications get evolved, because there is a historiography that is formed on those sources, and there are people who are affected by it, when culturally speaking. So a great problem of history and also military history is to assess the set of causes that produce a certain event. And from that passage from Clausewitz tells you very, straight and simple that sometimes there is no way out to understand that, and especially in military history is particularly complicated. So this set of relations most of the time is just not known. It can't be known. So also most of what we read from military history, I would say, is very, I would say it's much more foggy than many other historical stuff. I believe military history has a degree of inaccuracy in terms of irreality, say better, in terms of what actually happened, that other histories do not really have. And the problem is, in fact, that such events are so complex that nobody, even at the time, could fundamentally scope them in their entirety. So that there is still a huge debate, potentially even always room for further interpretations of military history, exactly because of this problem, that we don't know how it was. It doesn't take you to know, how the battle ended. Let's leave aside that sometimes it's historically uncertain who won, who was defeated, because these are also things that happen. But you don't do anything with things like, I don't know, the number of dead, or the, some behaviors that happen before or afterwards. You can't really fully know. So to reduce a war simulation to a set of polarities, because that's what war games, but I'm talking, not just about civilians here, I'm talking even about military war games, are very, very difficult to, it's kind of useless to pretend that that's how real war practically is. And don't believe that the military has so less problems than civilians because they're in the military, they know it all, they know how war is, because these are things that require a lifetime of studies, rather than just commanding from the field. It's definitely it's necessary to learn the art of warfare, because otherwise it's extremely rare to have a good commander that has never been in the military, that has just intellectualistically learned things and now allegedly knows how to use an army on the field. But what we try to do in military history is to look at the system in its entire complexity, and it's something extremely difficult. It takes an enormous amount of resources, and most of what we can actually talk about, especially now, like I'm doing on YouTube, is a very approximate, concise amount of considerations that are obviously approximate, are obviously imprecise, are obviously unreliable in some way. So today I actually had a pretty bad headache, because I think the only idiot who is capable of getting a cold in a full summer. Well, it's 30 grades Celsius outside. And therefore I wanted to talk to you about exactly this. I mean, what's the how do we spot reliability? I mean, how do we get interested in historical stuff, and how do we cope at the same time with the evident approximation of the accuracy of the historical information? This is a great problem, and I can tell you it's a great problem. It's a great mystery, both for people who explain or pretend to explain, just like I do in fact, and also for people who learn, which are sometimes even kind of the same people, because I believe that everybody interested in history has kind of referred about history to someone and still, of course, learned it before. Never make it easy. I mean, when you open even Schwerpunkt, but every kind of everything, books, TV, the internet, everyone, listen to professors speaking, just know that it's always imprecise. It's not reality. They're not telling you the truth. Nobody is telling you the truth, and not because there is no truth. There are people who will lead you from this sense, saying, but it's all it's all false. Believe my narrative, because it's more seductive. It's more, it's more enticing. It's the one that sounds best to you. Let's follow me. Those are dangerous people, and it's alarming, in fact, that today misinformation is so politically oriented, because guess what? We found out that through the internet, through the media, we can really come to deliver certain messages that it doesn't even matter about what the contents really are. Sometimes it's about the way they are told that can orientate someone emotionally towards one side or the other. And believe me, I'm not tender nor for one side or the other, even if I also have my kind of orientative alignment, but I believe that it's extremely easy to fall into misconceptions, and at this time in history, given the potential means that we have instead to know things, and it's dangerous. It's really dangerous, because in the middle, what you have left in the difference is responsibility. There is a lack of responsibility. There is a deficit of responsibilization towards our interpretation of reality, and studying history is definitely a medicine for this. And studying military history goes even beyond, because military history, as we have seen, is political. Military history has to do with not with war in itself, because as we have seen now, for repeating it over and over again from the Vom Kriege, every military action is controlled and modified at every single instant by politics. And there can't be anything like war if you don't have a politics and society that has this. So I think military history would be extremely more effective in terms of healing from this illness, how you want to call it, because it goes beyond the normal level of complexity that you're used to think to, and it makes you learn things that you couldn't even imagine you would learn at one point in your life. At least this has been my experience, and I know by fact actually that other people who kind of did similar things I did, that are even way more ahead than me in this field, state the same thing. I mean, they also had this experience all the time. So it's particularly useful, and I was thinking about making a video today about this, because it's way more it's a way more subtle concept that you imagine, because we all have the illusion to know things, and that's the real problem. Also with information, the problem is not really when you're given a wrong information. The problem is when you're not given information at all, because if you don't have an information, you can't even know that there is one. And you can't expect what it is. And that's why it's so imperative to keep learning constantly, because we will never learn as much as we need. But the more we do, the better we will live. So this is because we will acquire a greater ability in solving problems. History is indeed useful for solving problems, not just for saying for avoiding the problems, not making the past repeating itself. The past never repeats itself. That's the real problem. Because if the past repeated itself, well, okay, we would know what to do at this point, right? We would have formulas, systems. Guess what? We don't. And not because we are ignorant in historical terms, but because simply that doesn't work. Because otherwise we would have already figured it out. Naturally, there are certain sociological studies, think about economy, they kind of study things in this perspective, but guess what? Turns out no system is perfect, that when you try to reduce things to a pole, in fact, to a simple dichotomy, well, things do not work, because they're always way more complex than that. And the more you try to explore that overlooked side, the more you realize there's way more than you thought that was not foreseen. And that's the only way. It's acknowledging your limits that you can figure out to how to expand them within the same boundaries that you were given to think that you had already explored. Because we definitely have limits, and they're also pretty narrow in many ways. But still, what we can do in the within is shamefully unexploited. So, and I was reflecting about this because I often look sometimes at, when I make a video, at the whether someone made something similar out there, at least on YouTube, to search whether my titles come first or not. Well, there is a kind of random system formula. It's not really that simple, but I get curious about this, because naturally I invest a lot of time and resources to make these videos, and therefore I kind of have an economical interest in this sense, like saying, am I doing something right? My initial thought was, okay, let's talk about things that still nobody kind of talks much about, where you can't find, and by reasoning like this, I realized that, taking YouTube as an example, I think it's incredible how stereotyped the amount of videos that is out there is. I mean, how obviously there is definitely also in here an economical kind of market-like targeting, for which, of course, certain videos are done even with silly titles or weird pictures. They're clickbaits, fundamentally. Clickbaiters, but they also, when it comes to the contents, I don't realize this set of this depth of thinking that is actually pretty simple if even if you have decently acquainted to history at a certain level. I mean, I'm not saying you have to be a university professor, but even if you received kind of a good instruction at the end of your high school, you should be able to figure out that things are way more complex than what people tell you. Well, so I believe that it's alarming how this gap is still not filled, how nobody has expanded into it. That's seriously troubling, and I don't know, this in turn could lead to many other considerations, but there is another step, which is the grade 1.0 is like coming on a platform like this and start shouting your own opinions without even knowing what you're talking about, which is something we go all very much closer than we usually expect, because we'll think of ourselves like kind of heroes of good people, do great things, etc. But we're just pretty most of the times, at least, we're pretty mediocre. Then there is another stage. There's a kind of middle ground where you're still expanding a bit your horizons. You're still saying, "Wow, there is so much to learn," right? So it's too much. So you get fundamentally struck by the impossibility of achieving certain thing like a decent knowledge in most of the fields of of interest that you may even have. So now even obviously the old knowledge that exists, but even in history, there are people who spend an entire lifetime dedicated maybe to one topic that I can condensate in 2 hours of video, that people say, oh well, but it's so boring because it's so long. Well, okay, but maybe there is more to say, right? And that's why I make 2 hours long videos, because maybe there is someone who studies way more than 2 hours in his life to get to learn these things, and I am just the last part of the line of the row arriving here and starts telling about that for just 2 hours. So from my perspective, it's perfectly normal. For most YouTube watchers, it's definitely not. But not because it's boring to say 2 hours listening to me, but it's rare because I believe some of them do not grasp how much there is to know about certain topics. And at this point, there is something dangerous that usually happens anyway, is when most of the people who acknowledge this fundamentally amount of infinite knowledge, of course some of them are simply attracted by it, fortunately, and they dive into that to go learn new things. But there is a kind of a stage when there is a lot of relativism kicking in at the same time, because the idea is that this stage usually arrives when you have surpassed also your preconceived notions that you had maybe sedimented over time from your childhood. You had kind of created these patterns through which you interpreted the world, and you just applied them without asking whether they were correct or not. Then at a certain point things start crumble. This happens with people who start getting acquainted with scientific works. It happens frequently with your first years of university, if the university is good enough. It doesn't happen very often actually, but because it's difficult even to get people to at that stage. But the point is, in this sense, is okay. Well, I had to make collapse all my beliefs, all my ideas, and you start trying to be kind of flexible. You start saying, okay, yeah, this might be true, but on the other side, on the other hand, then after some time, actually, can take years, and this is I personally remain impressed by this when I think I experienced it. I spent some years after having doubted of so many things, and then I looked back at them with a bit more knowledge than I had before, and said, you know what, and maybe some things that I knew before the first stage weren't that bad, but now I can understand why they weren't, because in that first stage I just gave them for granted, so I made no effort to understand them. Maybe I didn't even actually understand them even if I claimed myself to be from that belief of that particular side, but I didn't fully understood it. But now I understand how they are used, because I know there is so much out there, and I know enough things to kind of orientate myself through them. There is still an immense quantity of things that I have to know, because actually on this path, the more you go on, the more you acknowledge that how much there is that you can't ever know, even dream to know in your entire life. But you at least are able to assess this, and this assessment is fundamental to actually reduce relativism, because at that point you don't need relativism anymore. You have so many informations, you have so many data that you can start moving around them. And the worst about this is that many people skip these passages. I mean, they don't evolve over time. They try to say, okay, you know what, I finished high school, so I don't have to read a book in my life anymore. According to stats, it seems, reading is not even so bad as it seems. There are more people reading, and it's kind of very positive. The problem is also, however, what is that you read first. Secondly, why? Why? Because I personally read, and how especially, I met people who have read all their lives and still, I think, didn't progress much. because also reading is different from studying, and also studying is different from learning, and it's very complex actually, and you can't achieve anything if you stop. It's like when you have to have your work done. It's not that there are many ways out of that. There is a kind of a physical effort that you have to do it to get through it. It's tiring, it's annoying. I'm not the kind of person who says, I could leave with a book in my hand 24 hours over 24, because I find personally reading, studying, and learning extremely tiring, because it is tiring. It consumes energies. It's something that takes a lot of commitment. So then you discover that most people just, they keep their books in their hands maybe for several hours in a day, but it's not that they read much into it. And I personally still have difficulties sometimes to read. It may seem strange to you, but I sometimes I read and say, oh my god, I'm so tired, I'm so lazy, I can't read, the same fixed with my mind on this and fully understanding every single thing I read. So the normal thing happens, and many readers start just, skipping through the lines and thinking about something else. And they say, oh, okay, how much did I read? 20 pages. Yeah, okay, but they won't remember anything about those pages. So there are many problems that, as you understand, all start from the problem with the way we try to interpret reality. So the concept of polarity that we have seen today is exactly one of them. Because the concept of polarity is something that you neither actually believe into if you start thinking about it for just 1 second. Because even the most unacquainted person with history, with reality, if asked what polarity is saying, maybe is not able to formulate an actual complex definition, etc. But in the moment in which he does it, maybe he's already starting from certain assumptions that take into requisition the same concept of polarity in itself. So it's not that easy, and therefore you have other terms like center of gravities and so on, and other stuff. But okay, we'll make a video on polarity another time. But always keep this in mind when you study history, when you study everything, actually, because this is not even history, and this is history is actually the history of everything, so it can be applied for literally everything. But it's very, very important to know, because if you treat knowledge as a sort of social status, like you want to make people think that you know something, this is also a trick. Most of us will, talk and talk and talk. They just are. We just are some good actors by a certain degree. This happens all the time with everyone. It's not that we actually know that much. I personally don't, to be honest. But there is also an impression of how to deliver knowledge, and sometimes what is disappointing arrived at. I think the third one of those stages I told to you about is that you start believing. I mean, you start having the intellectual means to process an information and evaluating whether it's reliable or not. And I'm not talking about actual, the actual content of it. Like you hear the news and you say, okay, well, I'm able to discern whether it's true or false, because that's not how it works. But it's the type of information that you're provided with that you can understand what kind of level is it, and sometimes you remain disappointed, because especially during the second stage you try to follow figures like teachers or people who have a particular authority in some field, and you say, who knows how much this person actually knows. Then you spend some years maybe learning from that same person, then you start understanding what the tricks are, where that person got his information from, and you can't even know what that person knows or doesn't know on an indirect base that you can't even ever be completely sure of. But given kind of the lack of something you can't predict also, given the existence of a certain thought, you can predict whether that person knows about something or not. And this is also what trains your brain to cope with that knowledge, because you also learn, very importantly, and this is particularly important today, to know how people think. Because if you know how people think, you have a big edge naturally, but you also know how you tend to think, what your limits can be, what you can do, what the others can't. So there are some kind of great geniuses were able to kind of go straight their own way without looking at other people. It's kind of also difficult to do, but that also depends on your personality, whether you believe in yourself, what kind of degree of determination you have. Even aggressiveness seemingly is something that is positive for intellectualism, because it doesn't make you waver in your beliefs, which is not always good, because actually some of the greatest jerks I know are people who are, in this sense, so full of them, convinced of their beliefs that they just aggress, but that those are still stopping at the first stage. This other type is like kind of a third stage, and is someone who actually listens, who is very able to listen more than anything else, and then processing the information, and then every once in a while saying something meaningful. So the more you speak and the less meaningful things you say. So I'm a very good proof of that, I believe. As I talk too much, to say too little, perhaps. Something too little meaningful, at least. Okay, there would be a lot to tell, but okay. Today I made it to at least address a couple of concepts that I care to share with you, at least, because I think they can be useful, if anything, or at least it's useful to think about them, to be also aware that, people are aware. Because another great problem in this is that you never know actually what's in other people's mind. Instead, I think that intellectual honesty is useful exactly for this, that you help people also deal better with each other. Like, what is that you effectively know and that you don't? How is that you work? How is it that you learn? Unfortunately, the world of intellectualism, I must say, I never bought into intellectualism. I don't know whether I'm intellectual or not personally, but I've always despised that, because sometimes I believe that it's like a show. Like, believe me, certain universities, certain environments, etc., are just shows, are showing off. Most of the people, I believe, who go on in those fields, are make it in those fields, are people just who can sell themselves better. It's not that they are actually very intelligent or very capable. So never trust even someone who says, I'm a PhD, so I know everything. No, it's not like it works like that. I can say that because I'm doing those things, so I can tell you quite easily that nobody's a super genius that knows. It's statistically very, very, very unlikely, and especially usually those people do not come to make this paths, and even though it's full of a lot of mentally disturbed people in this field to tell it all, but for the worse, not because they're particularly intelligent. That the boundary between foolishness and genius is very, very thin. But yeah, let's grow aware of this. Let's not hide behind fake interpretations of reality of what, because at the end of the day, I believe that even concepts like geopolitics, like symmetry, like polarity, now that we're coming back to this, fundamentally they are, I think, journalistic terms. Excuse me. Because I mostly heard them from that side. What is said is that also many, not just the civilian audience, but sometimes even the military audience comes to introduce these terms, actually without even understanding them. I have a very low level of trust in kind of every kind of sector of. I believe every environment has a very few good people that work well and kind of are pretty reluctant to this kind of interpretative patterns being applied in, to but that's the point. I think that these terms are used just to say, okay, I am using this word. Look, people, look, I'm using this word. I'm so able. I'm so smart. I'm so cool. I belong to the group of people who use those words, and that group is made up of intelligent people. Yay, that's really how it works. Believe me, sometimes certain concepts is not. And the same goes for the misinterpretations of von Clausewitz, or the readaptations now of the Clausewitzian theory to the 21st century, as if there was a need. Von Clausewitz was talking about war universally, metahistorically. Not metahistorically because it's still deeply grounded into history, but history doesn't. War doesn't change. That the war described by von Clausewitz is not meant to change in the historical times. And the reasoning here is that everybody wants to carve. It's like when those people who write a book will say, now we'll tell you how the Battle of Waterloo actually went. Because as if, all the other brains that studied the Battle of Waterloo for 200 years now were a bunch of morons that need just, an idiot to write a cheap book to sell on Amazon, stuff like that, on the Battle of Waterloo. Yeah, right. As if about the Battle of Waterloo so many things were popping out that we haven't figured out before. Oh my god. People want to sell themselves. That's the truth. We all do, in a certain measure. We all do. There is nothing wrong about that. But the problem is to unmask the... because there are people who fall into that trick. So this is the cool thing about knowledge, is that it doesn't make you fall into that trick. In life it's easier because it gets actually simpler. Knowledge is definitely... you can definitely get, in order to push this ability to build up this criticism, you definitely have to venture into kind of dangerous waters. Like, you have to get into complex things, to work, to struggle a lot, because otherwise you can't progress, like in anything. But after that, things actually get simpler. Like many problems, like many, so they kind of solve themselves, because now you can, you went past behind them. You're able to watch them from the distance and say, okay, was that really a problem? This is actually easy to understand. Even if you had, you had problems at school with some, with a subject, you didn't understand. Look at after 10 years to say, well, that was actually pretty simple. And why is that? Well, is that because you probably have learned something more in the meanwhile. That's why it happens. So, believe me, it's all a trick. It's all a great trick. And the greatest thing is to become self-standing. Because that doesn't mean that you can't stand on yourself to say things. But you stand on yourself because you don't need anything but reading and studying on your own to... You don't have to ask anyone. And let's be honest, we are all here for that. Because what is that you listen my videos for? You essentially, maybe you don't have time to read those things. You want to find the books. You're interested because you're searching for someone who maybe had those interests too. So maybe can tell you, okay, well, maybe read that book because it's more or less useful. Can be of help. We all do it for this reason. So at one point you pass the barrier and start saying, okay, you know what, I don't need... now I'm capable of doing it on my own. And that's a great thing, being able to do things on my own without someone helping you. That's what also I believe political is very healthy. You shouldn't wait for someone to pay you, to get things for you just because you are you. But you should do things for you because you are you. This is the real point. And also this apparent gap that I was telling you about our actual knowledge and our learning potential at this point in history. The gap between these two has increased sensibly, and this goes in parallel with certain political ideas. They want people to get things without actually having deserved them at all. I believe this is actually real. So a good cure for that would be to be educated in many ways. And you can get today, the beauty of today's world is that after millennia of struggles, we all have the means to get educated by ourselves. Of course, getting help is better. Having money is also better. Doing certain things that help you, even luck. Being lucky is better. But nobody's really, none of these is actually an excuse to say, okay, I don't want to learn anything. I just want to be helped by someone because, you know, I want to draw away something from that person for me. Because that's what, at the end of the day, the truth really is. That this is going back to tribalism. This is kind of decline of civilization in many ways, and I strongly believe it. I don't think civilization is meant to grow constantly. It's not true. It's never been true in history. So, excuse me. I don't understand why it should be true even now. And I think that this new challenge is way more demanding because it's something completely new by certain standards, if you think about it in historical perspective as well. But okay, whatever. For now, we're getting too philosophical. I will deal with this another time. So for now, I just hope, as always, that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me, as always as well. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.